My friends, this is one of the most intelligent and interesting books I've ever read on the history of interpretation, so I want to tell you about it. I think understanding the story that Legaspi tells and the bigger story, that is the frame of the story Legaspi tells, is just really important to understanding where historical criticism comes from, why the Bible is taught the way it is in universities and seminaries, and just lots of different things. And there are lots of ways to tell this story. But I think the kind of case study that this author takes up and the way he tells it, just really illuminating. It just really made me think. So here we go. Take this little ride with me. The author, his name is Michael Legaspi. I've actually met him several times. He went to the same PhD program that I did, had my same doctoral advisor. Shout out to Peter Machinist, Harvard University. And we chatted a few times, but he was a generation ahead of me in my doctoral program. And this book is a revision of his doctoral dissertation there. So he has a PhD from Harvard and he taught at Creighton. He also taught at Penn State. He is currently a professor at St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary, an Orthodox seminary. He's an Orthodox. Michael Legaspi is a person of deep faith, and that faith now expressed in the institutional identity of the Orthodox Church. So his title of the book, The Death of Scripture, you can't just stop there and think, oh, this is a guy who wants the Bible to die. No. The Death of Scripture and the Rise of Biblical Studies maybe already suggests part of the story there. Did the Bible have to die, in a sense, did the Bible have to die as Scripture, spiritually or theologically, in order for the discipline of biblical studies to arise? So we can pose that as a question. The central figure for the case study in this book is a German scholar in the 1700s. I think he lived for about 80 years, from about 1710 to 1791 or something like that. Johann David Michaelis. He was a professor at Göttingen, which was absolutely a major center of German learning in the 18th century. Of course, the American model of higher education, in large part, is derived from a German model, which tries to present students with great research, but also in a very general sense. You know, we get an idea of what we might call general education from the German university system and many other things. And so this was an important crucible in which lots of things were happening in the 18th century. We're thinking about the Enlightenment. We're thinking about the rise of disciplines, all the things today that we call disciplines like sociology and history in a really proper sense, and just theology and philosophy and all these things. This setting was very important for the birth of these areas. Michaelis was, in particular, a professor of the classics and of the ancient Near Eastern world, particularly of the Hebrew language. Okay, now let me summarize the bigger frame in which this story is important, after which I want to give you 3 important moments from the book by quotes and so on that I think tell you how interesting this study is. Maybe it'll prompt you to pick it up and read it yourself. The bigger story is this. For about 1,200 years, you had one book, one church, and one authoritative interpretation of the book, and that is the Bible and Catholicism, and the hierarchy and authority of the Catholic Church. That is a pretty good run. I mean, can you imagine any kind of text or interpretive system having that kind of dominance today? I mean, YouTube itself is an example of just like the absolute bewildering variety of interpretations and people out there. There's a different church on every street corner in your neighborhood. I mean, we all know how this works. This is the story of modernity and even post-modernity. But I mean, think of the dominance of the Catholic Church. And yes, of course, there's also orthodoxy, right? But I mean, in Europe, you had this authoritative structure, which was absolutely nuclear bombed by the Reformation, right? And that fracture that the Reformation wrought upon Europe, upon the world in the early 1500s, resulted in very real and very painful societal and ideological and political fractures in Europe. I mean, you had basically about 150 years of the so-called European wars of religion. I mean, let's just focus on that. I mean, these wars, if you go to the Wikipedia page of the wars of religion and just scroll down, I'll link it below, and just scroll down the many different wars in every single country, it is absolutely wild. The most major of these was, of course, the 30 Years' War in Central Europe and in Germany and all over the place. I mean, the 30 Years' War just wrecked Europe. It was one of the most dangerous and deadly human conflicts of all time, certainly the most deadly in Europe before World Wars I and II in the 20th century, and concluded by the famous Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which in many ways created the modern system of nation states in Europe that prevailed in modernity. Also, allowed Calvinism to be a publicly recognized religion, maybe not by Catholics or by the Pope at the time, but just in general. And so a major question arises that someone like Johann David Michaelis at the University of Göttingen had to deal with, which is, how do you just teach the Bible in a university system, in any system that could be considered public in any way, in the aftermath of something like that? Do you just go and teach your own confessional viewpoint? Or do you try to create a kind of a table, a kind of a setting, to use a word that Legaspi uses often in the study, an irenic setting, a friendly setting where people, instead of just appealing to their mystical beliefs about the text, actually would have to adduce evidence and history and language and things like that in order to make an argument about the text. Okay? So that's what he's going to have to do, right? How can we create, in a sense, a kind of a new Bible? If the old Bible was the Bible of just almost like, you could think of it like a mystical, irrational attachment, right, under this single interpretive authority, how do you create a new Bible in a new setting, a Bible that will now be a rival to the confessional scripture of the old world, which is now dead and gone, and resulted in all kinds of wars and divisions and losses? Okay. That's the moment he's studying. He's studying how did Johann David Michaelis and others like him do that. So let's go straight to the book. 3 moments that I think will illuminate the intrigue and the argument here. These are just 3 moments upon doing some rereading here. I went back and looked like, where did I star and underline things the most? Okay, well, here are a few places, just 3. The first one, I thought this was really illuminating. This is on page 17 of the book. He says, the great question among 17th century interpreters was whether the Bible, in light of its textual characteristics, was perspicuous, whether its wording and meaning were self-evident or not. In other words, does the Bible actually have a clear message? This was not surprising. Anabaptist conventicles, spiritualist sects, and anti-Trinitarian groups grew precipitously out of reform movements in the 1520s and 30s. By the middle of the 16th century, the Reformation had remade societies and governments. Churches and territories across Europe lay in a patchwork of state-sponsored confessions, with the division between Lutheran and Reformed often as rigid as the one between Catholics and Protestants. So it wasn't just, Lutheran is Reformation versus Catholics. It was also Lutherans and Reformed. So you had these other conflicts blossoming as well. Theologian Ephraim Radner, in an insightful and important book on the theological consequences of Christian division, describes the situation faced by Catholic and Protestant biblical interpreters, and he's quoting this other work, that 2 portions of a divided church could never, in the face of their critics or antagonists, persuasively extricate themselves from the circularity of their criteriology was a realization quickly made by both controversialists and religious scoffers. In other words, each of these groups, ultimately, the kind of arguments they were making were just circular arguments which depended on you already believing in the thing that you were arguing for, okay? For each group, I'm quoting again now from Legaspi, for each group, the presence of the other Christian confession, which also claimed fidelity to the Bible, the same Bible, made it necessary for each group to defend its distinctive mode of biblical interpretation. In each case, the need to create separation from and establish superiority over the other led Catholics and Protestant interpreters to emphasize beliefs and practices that they did not share with one another. Theology and biblical interpretation, then, were conducted at the margins of the respective traditions where differences were to be found, and not at the centers where common ground existed. So in other words, my summary, The Reformation created, among other things, an arms race of scholarship to try to prove why your view of the Bible now, in the face of the other, was actually correct. And what does this lead to? This leads to us not saying, hey, what do we, after all is said and done, what do we really agree on? No, you focus on what you disagree on. So this is part of the legacy of what it means to do biblical studies in the historical, critical, university mode that grew up out of the Reformation. It's an emphasis on difference. It's an emphasis on those points of disagreements. It's an emphasis on places where Scripture is not clear. Because these are the places where you can go and then make your distinctive argument for your particular faith movement, whatever it is. Yeah, and I guess until reading this book, I hadn't thought of it that way. Like, oh yeah, okay. This is one result of the Reformation, is this arms race of interpretations, which further deepens the fracture. Okay. Moment number 2, I go here to page 115, and I have a link, by the way, down below to the book here if you want to purchase. I also have a link to an article that Legaspi wrote online where you can kind of get some sense of the argument as well as a book review and some other things. Okay, so here, and this is really a whole chapter. I was struggling to find something to read in this chapter. The chapter is called Lowth, Michaelis, and the Invention of Biblical Poetry. Robert Lowth was a British scholar who lived at the same time as Michaelis, and whom Michaelis actually brought to Germany and whose work Michaelis tried to popularize in Germany. What did Lowth do? He was most famous for essentially, in a way, inventing the idea of parallelism for biblical poetry. Those of you who have maybe taken an introduction to Old Testament class before, done some reading, you know that parallelism is this idea that biblical scholars use, or the word that biblical scholars use to describe the character and form of poetry that we find in the Old Testament. They seem to say something and then they seem to say it again. Or they seem to say something and then say the opposite of that thing but related to the thing. So you could have a kind of thought rhyming in a sense, or thought anti-rhyming, or a kind of stair-step parallelism where, you say something but then you amplify it. So the two statements are always connected. And Lowth correctly recognized that this was a major feature. He might have gone a little too far though. He really wanted, as many did during this period, and this is the highlight then of what I wanted to say from this chapter, they wanted to basically make the Old Testament into something like a classic text. Something that could sit really nicely alongside classical poetry from the Greek and Roman world. Because this is one of the major themes now. Let's not study the Bible as though it's some weirdo document that rules the destinies of all and it has its own special rules for interpretation and you can't understand them by way of understanding any other literature. No, we want to put the Bible in a productive conversation with the classics. And this, of course, would become more important and more necessary once other texts in the Semitic language family generally were discovered, like the Gilgamesh epic and the Enuma Elish and all these famous texts, these famous cuneiform documents, the Ugaritic literature, the Baal epic, etc., etc., etc. But back at this time, they didn't actually know about those. So what did you have to compare the Bible to? If you wanted to sit and have like a world religions class, let's say, or a kind of like great classic readings in ancient literature, you wanted, for people like Lowth and Michaelis, you wanted to be able to put the Bible alongside those other texts, precisely so that you could start reading the Bible as a classic text of world literature. Which is great, which any kind of Bible-believing Christian would want to do too. It's just that you wouldn't want it to stop there, but you can see how this move, by putting the Bible alongside these other texts, by inventing ideas about what biblical poetry might have been like, that it had a meter, or maybe it originally had a certain kind of rhyme, or if you could reconstruct it. You got to kind of do a little bit of violence to the text, as James Kugel shows in his book, The Idea of Biblical Poetry. Sometimes these attempts to make the Bible fit this model of classical poetry actually it's just kind of garbled, okay? But that was precisely the project. Let's get the Bible into the conversation. Let's get a seat at the table for the Bible, right? So there are some pros and some cons here, okay? I'm going to read a quote here from page 115. Lowth's quest to recover the ethos of biblical poetry was rooted in the sacred status of the Bible, yes, but, however, Lowth reanalyzed sacredness, making it the functional equivalent of a literary excellence capable of arousing feelings of sublimity. So you have a kind of precursor to romantic ideas here of the sublime and of poetry and of things like this. I go now to the conclusion of this chapter. Biblical poetry, Legaspi writes, was a successful 18th century invention. Okay, is there poetry in the Bible? Yes, but they kind of invented it in a very particular kind of way, as I've been describing, trying to find meter and form and put it alongside these other texts. Though there is no word for poetry in biblical Hebrew, as James Kugel points out, the identification of biblical literature with poetry has always been seductive. Before the age of Louth, prophecy was not a subcategory of sacred poetry, but rather, according to Christian tradition, a complex mosaic of images and foretellings that ultimately pictured Christ. The Psalms, though lyrical, were principally liturgical, something you did in worship, okay? They gave voice to the experience of the chosen people enduring the vicissitudes of a troubled but triumphant salvation history. To recast all of this material as poetry, however, was to offer a radically new frame of reference. As one scholar astutely observes, the idea of biblical poetry emerged precisely when theological definitions were receding to the margins of exegetical discourse. The concept of poetry allowed interpreters direct access to the Bible, independent of the grand narratives of the canonical tradition. In other words, my summary, by getting the Bible into this realm of a classic text with poetry and so on, you can now read the Bible like a normal ancient text, right? A normal ancient text. And he goes on to write, poetry as a category cuts across the canon, turning Moses, David, Solomon, and Isaiah from prophets and kings, or perhaps saints and sinners, into classical artists. They're poets, right? You can study them along with Homer and Virgil and others. Okay. Finally, I want to turn here to, things get a little spicy on the very last couple of pages of the book. As finally, Legaspi, after teasing us with all of this and maybe leaving us wondering what he thinks about contemporary historical criticism and our contemporary world that has grown out of this type of study and this type of seeing the Bible, right, as a classic text alongside others. He's been teasing us, but so what does he think about the way that this happens in the contemporary world? Well, he goes for it on the last 2 pages. This is my third moment. He talks in particular about major biblical scholar today, John Collins at Yale University, Yale Divinity School. And he talks about the way that John Collins has adopted historical criticism and what he uses it for in particular, and draws a comparison with Michaelis. Let me read. Another prominent biblical scholar, Legaspi writes, John Collins, has also abandoned historical criticism, although he has not admitted to doing so. He talks about an essay that Collins wrote in which his purpose was to assess the relation of postmodern biblical criticism to historical criticism by arguing that postmodern interpretive strategies can be fully assimilated into modern biblical criticism, which Collins calls historical criticism. Collins aims to redeem the discipline from irrelevance. We're always trying to do that as biblical scholars. And that's what Michaelis was trying to do as well, okay? You don't want people to think the study of the Bible is just something weird that like old people do in Sunday school. You gotta redeem it. So Collins aims to redeem the discipline from irrelevance and defend it from methodological supersessionism. In Collins's judgment, postmodern interpretation is only an extension of historical criticism, despite the fact that postmodernists programmatically deny the objectivity, knowability, and truthfulness of history. Postmodern criticism and historical criticism are ultimately compatible in Collins's view, and Collins likes historical criticism. He does historical criticism, right? But he thinks they're compatible. Why? Because the real value of historical criticism is its usefulness in structuring a non-confessional mode of discourse. As Collins says, the, quote, historical focus has been a way of getting distance from a text, of respecting its otherness. It allows participants to structure a conversation about the Bible according to academic rules. In other words, Legaspi wants to show here as he concludes the book, someone like John Collins is doing essentially something very much like Michaelis' project. What is historical criticism for? Why would we study the Bible this way? It's in order to dunk on fundamentalists. It's in order to dunk on people who read the Bible in a confessional mode. It's to construct an entirely different kind of Bible. I again quote Legaspi. Collins's principal academic interest is ultimately a moral one. He wants to protect a version of academic freedom and to fight fundamentalism by using scholarship, as we sometimes do as smart people, okay, by using scholarship to defeat religious certitude. In other words, all of these tools and these books and these things, they're really like weapons in a war against other people whose ideas you find dangerous, ridiculous, idiotic, or whatever, and you want to basically take their Bible, set it aside, replace it with something like a new Bible interpreted under new kinds of rules. The fact that he does this, Legaspi says, Collins, as a biblical scholar fully committed to history and philology while disdainful of confessional interpretation, is a testimony to the durability of Michaelis' legacy. So this story about Michaelis is really relevant. In concluding this study, though, he's down to his last paragraph, Legaspi is, I would like to offer a brief reflection. I believe that the scriptural Bible and the academic Bible are fundamentally different creations oriented toward rival interpretive communities. Though in some ways homologous, they can and should function independently if each is to retain its integrity. It has become clear, though, so he respects the kind of academic work of someone like Collins or Michaelis. He just wants to point out that this is a different task from reading the Bible as scripture, as the product of and liturgical and worshipful and belief center of the church. It has become clear, he writes, that academic criticism in its contemporary form cannot offer a coherent, intellectually compelling account of what this information is actually for. What critics like Collins have done as a result is to shift the rationale for modern criticism away from intellectual and back toward the social and the moral. There is value in the social and moral byproducts of academic criticism in things like tolerance, reasonableness, and self-awareness. Any fans of tolerance and reasonableness and self-awareness out there? The problem, Legaspi writes, now he reveals his view here. The problem is that these rather thin, pale virtues, reasonableness, tolerance, these thin, pale virtues seem only thinner and paler when compared to the classic virtues associated with the scriptural Bible. Instead of bland tolerance, love that sacrifices itself. Instead of an agreeable reasonability, hope that opens the mind to goodness and greatness that it has not yet fully imagined. And instead of critical self-awareness, faith that inspires and animates the human heart. Academic criticism tempers belief. Calm down there, don't get so excited. Well, that word is not actually translated. Well, historically we've not found, it's like, calm down over there. Academic criticism tempers belief while scriptural reading edifies and directs it. In this sense, they work at cross purposes. Yet, each mode presumes the value of knowledge. Okay. And he ends with a pithy thought on how maybe there's some kind of medium ground that we can occupy where they both kind of come together. So anyway, that's a review of Michael Legaspi, The Death of Scripture and the Rise of Biblical Studies. Great book. Totally recommend it. It's not a very long book, only about 168 pages long. So it's definitely something you can read and benefit a lot from. And yeah, hope you give a chance to give it a look.